Greetings, everybody. So let's continue with our Mīmāṃsā. We got to verse 72, and I'm just going to get you the date for Kumarila Bhatta, who's the author of this passage from the Shloka Vartika. You don't need to know those names, but for anyone interested, he was an 8th century philosopher of the Mīmāṃsā school. Remember, they're the Vedic ritualists seeking to perpetuate the Vedic rites and finding philosophical justification for doing so. Kumarila Bhatta was a formidable philosopher, great opponent of Buddhism, because of course Buddhists are going to say, as we'll find out in our next class, our next lecture, everything is momentary, which is why they don't accept God. The Buddhists can't have an eternal entity, neither an eternal Atman, like Vedanta would hold, nor an eternal Īśvara. So if the Buddhists, then everything is momentary, lasts just an instant and creates an effect. That effect in its moment of existence is both an effect of a previous cause, and it becomes a cause for the next effect. So you have this, the reality is nothing other than a flow of these infinitely small moments. A moment of reality. So for example, this piece of wood consists of whatever entities that are all interdependent, all interconnected. And each of the entity, they would only last, if you want to use the term atom, you can, or a subatomic particle, but they wouldn't do that because Buddhists would say everything is infinitely reducible. So you never end up at any kind of like particle-like substratum, which is no longer reducible. I'm just throwing this out because we're going to be needing this for our next lecture. So for the Buddhists, everything only lasts a moment. And in that moment produces its subsequent moment. Okay, so it's called kshanika in Sanskrit. Don't worry about the name. Okay, so that obviously goes against what the Mīmāṃsā want to say, which is that the Vedas are eternal, reality is eternal. If the Vedas are eternal, then the words of the Vedas are eternal. If the words of the Vedas are eternal, then words refer to objects, like the word wood refers to a piece of wood. So if the words are eternal, then the objects must be eternal. So they're the other end of the spectrum from the Buddhists, who believe in everything is momentary. So he was a fierce defender of Vedic ritualism, of the Vedic texts, against other schools. Right now he's debating Īśvara. So in this passage we're reading, because our course is on Īśvara, then he's not engaging the Buddhists, but he's well known. And some people say he was, of all the Vedic schools, he knew Buddhism the best. In fact, there's even stories that he was training to become a Buddhist and then left that. And that the great Dharmakirti, one of the most powerful Buddhist intellectuals, was actually his nephew or something like that. So whatever the stories are and whether they're true or not, clearly the tradition identifies him as being very, very intimately familiar with Buddhist philosophy, and therefore his critique coming from a place of full awareness of the Buddhist position. But anyway, don't worry about any of that. That sort of thing isn't just background information. So, okay, so he is arguing against Īśvara, and we go to verse 73, which we'll bring up on the screen right here. Now, remember, so the argument is, why, if there is a God, remember, Kumarila Bhatta is rejecting. We're now in the section of the course, started last week, then today, and then we'll look at Buddhism, then we'll look at Jainism, then we'll look at Sankhya. We have 2 weeks, or it may stretch onto 2.5 or 3 weeks. It will take whatever time we need to take. But this is now the atheistic section of the course. Our course is on God. Well, God includes, the topic of God includes arguments by those who do not accept there is a God. It's still kind of like dealing with the notion of God in Indian philosophy, whether God, such a God-like being exists or does not exist. Okay, so he's on the side now of Nir Īśvara. Remember, Vada is a point of view. Nir Īśvara Vada. Don't worry about all the Sanskrit terms. I think Laura gave you a list of the terms you're responsible for in the quizzes. But, I know it's a lot, but don't panic. You have your reading, the terms are all written there. If you need to know how to spell them, and just let it go through your mind. We're engaging a different culture, thousands of miles away, well over, some of this stuff goes back 2,000 years. We should let it speak in its own terms, because some of these terms don't have good English equivalents. So we're stepping out of our box, our cultural and linguistic box that, of familiarity with certain conceptual and linguistic ways of thinking and talking. And we're going to, and then we're engaging another tradition. Okay, so let's just jump straight back in. Number 73. And it is now, right? So the argument is, the discussion has been, well, if there is a creator God, why would God desire to create a world? What would be that desire be? So right now we're focusing on the desire aspect. If God creates, then he must desire to create, right? He's not a robot. It's not a mindless entity. People act because they have a desire to attain some result. So if people want to posit from Mīmāṃsā, from Kumarila's point of view, they're going to posit that this is a God who creates. Then they need to indicate what would be the desire that would trigger such a creation. So it is not. Let me get rid of this phone. Over there. Just toss it on the ground. Okay, it's not possible for the God's desire to be produced without any cause. Desires, when you desire something, there's a cause that triggers that desire. For example, I desire an ice cream. So what's the cause of that desire? Well, the ice cream. There's an object outside of my mind that triggers a desire in my mind to do something. So what's the cause? If there be any such cause of the production of the God's desire, then that could also be the cause of the production of the elements too. If you say there's some other cause outside of God, right? The ice cream, I desire an ice cream. It's outside of me. It's in the store, and it triggers a desire for an ice cream. So what triggers the desire of God to create? So the implication being it must be something outside of God. Well, let that thing then be the cause of creation. Why do you need, what's God got to, why do you have to bring in an intermediary, God? Let that, whatever that thing is that triggers the desire in God, let me create, right? God decides to create, right? So desire emerges in the mind of God. Where what's the trigger for that desire? Something outside of God. So let that thing, whatever it is outside of God, which is supposed to trigger God's desire, let that be the cause of creation. Okay, so if there be any such cause of the production of God's desire, then that could also be the cause of the production of the elements too, meaning creation. Creation is made of the elements, material things, like particles and so forth. Right, so that's what one argument. Now, if one were to argue, that would be the Purva-paksha, opposing point of view. So now Mīmāṃsā is saying, okay, well, we made that point. Now, let's suppose you were to make a subsequent point. So let's see, what is that? If one were to argue that the production of the bodies of living beings is controlled, right? How do the bodies, like trees and our bodies, how do they get to be produced? Right, theist wants to say original creation is God. So if one were to say the production of the bodies of living beings is controlled by an intelligent agency in the form of God's desire, right? Why? Because they are made up of constituent parts. Remember the argument. This jar is made up of parts. I've got a lid, I've got the jar, I've got the candle inside, and they're parts. And you can go deeper and deeper and say, well, even the lid is made of subatomic particles and forth. So anything that's produced, according to Nyaya and certain ways of thinking, there must be a producer who brings them together. Who brought the atoms together, right? It's the same old argument. With a fine-tuning argument in Western philosophy. Who brings things together? So if you're going to say that, says Kumarila, if you're going to say that the bodies are made of certain constituent parts, right? Arms, legs, molecules of the skin, right? All come together to form a body, like a house, right? A house, it has parts, and somebody has put the parts together to make a house. Somebody frames the window, someone frames the door. They're all the parts of a house. They don't just assemble together magically. So if you were to argue, meaning now if the theist were to argue that the production of bodies is controlled by intelligence, that's exactly what the theists say. There's going to be intelligence behind creation. Creation meaning the bringing together of in ingredients that then emerge and eventually emerge as mountains and planets and universes and seas and bodies and everything else. If you just say that, then it should be answered thus. So that's the Purva Paksha. And now we get the Mīmāṃsā response to this argument, that anything made of parts needs to be put together. The parts need to be put together to make a whole, whatever it is, a whole, whatever this is, a candle. Now, what's the response of the Mīmāṃsā then, but Kumarila? If by control, it is meant only the fact of some intelligent agency being the cause of creation. If you say that, well, okay, that the production of parts, the putting together of parts, the production of a whole needs some intelligence. If you say that, then inasmuch as all creation could be accomplished by the actions of living beings, which are intelligent agents, your argument would become redundant, providing a fact already proved. He's saying, okay, you say you want intelligence, you need intelligence. He said, we agree with that. Mīmāṃsā says, we just don't think that intelligence is God. Let the living entities, they're intelligent. Let them be the impetus, just like Sankhya would say. Let them be the impetus. Remember, Mīmāṃsā doesn't accept creation at all. There was no creation. The world is beginningless. So now they're giving a hypothetical argument. They're not actually trying to prove that living entities cause creation, which Sankhya wants to say. They're just trying to, Mīmāṃsā is just trying to reject the notion of God. He's saying, look, if you want to say that's an intelligent, there has to be intelligence behind the creation of the universe, well, it's redundant. Everybody agrees. For no one denies the fact that the diversity of the world is regulated by the actions of living entity. Everyone accepts, Buddhists, Jains, that karma is the operating law that causes me to have this body, you to have the bodies you have, the tree behind me to have the body it has. All theists, atheists, the Buddhists who believe everything is momentary, Sankhya with their pradhana, everybody accepts it, sure, that it's karma, which operates on the intelligence of the living entity. The living entities they're conscious and they act, and according to the action, they generate a reaction, and the law of karma then puts it all together. So he's saying, well, you don't need to posit an Īśvara then. It's redundant. So that's the argument. No one denies the fact that the diversity of the world is regulated by the actions of living, intelligent beings. Just don't bring God into it, says Mīmāṃsā, says Kumarila. And you have the same redundancy, meaning, what you're arguing something, you don't need to argue something everybody accepts. It's redundant. It's useless. Make an argument it's something that people don't accept or disagree with. So it's redundant if you argue something commonly accepted, right? Everyone accepts karma, acting on the free will of the living entities who are intelligent. So we have intelligence then as a cause of the production of bodies. And you have the same redundancy, even if by control, you mean that the creation of bodies is preceded by the desire of an intelligent agent. Because the actions of living beings too are preceded by a desire to act on the part of acting person. So he's saying, you want to say that God has a desire and he creates, and that's the cause of creation. Well, and you insist it's got to be intelligent. Well, we agree it's intelligent. We agree it's preceded by desire. But it's not the desire or intelligence of a God. It's the desire or intelligence of the living entity that triggers action, and that then results in the production of the bodies and forms of the world based on karma. So we agree that it's intelligence. Well, the disagreement then is why do you have to posit one single solitary supreme intelligence? Let the intelligence with a desire to create. Let the intelligence of the living entity and the desire of the living entity are sufficient. Why introduce an unnecessary extra ingredient, right? Philosophy is about simplifying arguments. The Occam's razor, sometimes it's called in the West. Less entities you have in the formulation of your argument, the better your argument is. The simpler argument is the more direct, and therefore the more it has the best. It's the most philosophically viable. You have less intermediary entities. If you say if this and if this and if this and then there's this, it becomes complicated. If you just say, well, this and this, and 2 or 3 ingredients, then your argument is lighter. It's called lagutva, and therefore more, from a philosophical and scientific point of view, it's a better argument because you have less hypotheticals. You're introducing less hypothetical entities. If, however, you mean that the creation follows immediately after the desire, so you want to say, okay, if what you theists are trying to say is creation is boom, it just pops out immediately after desire, then we say there's no such immediate sequence, even in the case of your own instance, the making of a house not following immediately after the desire of the builder, right? So the Nyayika, the theist, we're going to do Nyaya next. Nyaya is the school of logicians. After we finish this atheistic portion with Mīmāṃsā and the Buddhists and the Jains, and then there's a Sankhya atheistic argument. Then we're going to go back to our course book, dusty course book. We did the first half of it, which was Vedanta. We looked at Shankara and Vachaspati Mishra. And the second half is going to be Nyaya. Nyaya are one of the 6 schools of Indian philosophy. And they are the logicians. Rather than quoting scripture, which Shankara does, they or talk about perception, direct perception, which yoga does. Nyaya talks about inference, that we can deduce the existence of an Īśvara, or rather induce, induction. And one of the induction is, well, everything we see that's produced, and here's the house, the making of a house, right? So that's an example, or a palace. It doesn't just self-assemble. There's intelligence behind it. And so we extend that. The universe is an infinitely more complicated sort of house. So if there is a little intelligence, like a builder and an architect, we have limited intelligence. If they produce a house, well, how much more infinitely intelligent is the builder of the universe? In fact, that builder knows, just like the builder of a house knows everything about the house, has knowledge of the house, the pipes, the electricals, where everything's going to go. The architect and the builder know that. So if someone is building a creation, you must know everything about creation, and therefore that being must be omniscient. So now he's saying he's taking that very standard argument from Nyaya, the school of logicians, and I may sometimes say Nyayika. The actual Nyaya is the school, and the members of the school are called Nyayika. Don't worry, it's Nyaya, Nyayika. It's like Vishnu, Vaishnava, Shiva, Shaiva, Mīmāṃsā, Mīmāṃsaka. The follower of something, you often put an aka at the end. Nyayik or ika, Nyayika. So the logicians, okay? So they would say that, so you mean that the creation of bodies is preceded by the desire of an intelligent agent, like the builder desires to build a house, because the actions of living beings are preceded by it, a desire to act on the part of the acting person. He's saying, okay, let's accept that you need a desire, but let the living entities be the, oh, we just read that, sorry. Let the living entities let the living entities suffice as the instigators of action based on desire. But we read that twice, sorry. If, however, you mean that the creation follows immediately after the desire, God, you desire, but boom, the universe, just manifest. If you want to say that immediately, then we say there's no example of that. You can't prove that. You can't use your example of a house. You want to use your example of a house to prove that there must be an intelligent designer. Well, a house isn't built immediately. It takes many months to build a house. So then you can't use that as an example for instant creation. You need to give us an example. When you do logic, you have to give an example in your sphere of perception. And then you can posit as, posit something beyond your sphere of perception. So you say, okay, just as a palace or a house requires an intelligent designer, so the creation requires a super intelligent designer, fine. But Kumarila says, but your argument's going to cause problems for you, because then you can't say the creation was instantaneous, because your example of a house, no one builds a house instantaneously. So there is no immediate sequence, even in the case of your own instance, immediate sequence. There's no immediate creation. in your own instance. And this in the example that the Nyaya bring forward, using the house as an illustration, because the making of a house does not follow immediately after the desire of the builder. So you can't say God desires and immediately, immediately creation. We have no proof for that. So you can't talk about a creation that that is, and he could go on to argue, and you could say, well, and if it takes a lot of time for God to create, well, then he's not omnipotent, then, is he? So you could pursue that argument, but he doesn't. He moves on to another argument. Your premises, two are inconclusive, meaning deficient and doubtful, right? They don't lead to a positive conclusion. They're missing something, or they're doubtful at best, with regard to the body of God himself, right? Because if God creates, he must have a body. Which we could challenge that, but we're just following his argumentation, right? The builder of a house has a body, and he uses his hands and his instruments of action to build the house. He uses the eyes to see things, the hands to pick up bits of wood, and so forth. So if you say that, if you talk about God's body, for his body too must have a beginning, in as much as it is also a body like ours, made up of constituent parts. If you're going to say God has a body with which he creates, well, bodies are made up of parts, and then you've got the same problem, because a body made up of parts, well, who brought those parts together? Same argument, right? This is my jar made up of parts. And you want to say that somebody must have brought those parts together to create the whole of a jar. And likewise with my body. Bodies of living entities, they're parts, and they're brought together, okay, by karma or whatever. But let's say God does that. Let's say God superintends karma. Well, now what are you going to say? And then, but then you say for God to create, Mīmāṃsā would say he would need a body. You can challenge that. Say no, he doesn't need a body. He can just do it by will. But right now, let's go with the argument. The argument is you're using the example of a builder of a house, and you want to say just like that, analogous to that, God builds the universe. Problem number one: builder doesn't. We just discussed, doesn't build instantly. So you can't say God creates instantly. Problem number two, with your analogy, you Nyaya people, you theists, right? Kumara is saying, implying. Problem number two, builders have bodies, which are themselves parts. And those bodies were caused by something else, the parents or whatever you want to say. So if you're going to say God has a body, to build, create, you have to have a body. Then who brought those parts together? Is there another God? That brought together the parts for the God number one? Is there God number two? And then if God number two brought together the ingredients for God number one's body, well, then God number two must have a body to do anything with. So then who brought his? And you end up in an infinite regress. Okay. So his body too must have had a beginning, in as much as it's also a body like ours, made up of constituent parts. If it be argued that the production of the God's body too is controlled by his own intelligence, right? God just makes his own body, just wills it. He doesn't need to have somebody else make it for him. He is all powerful in his own will, and he creates a body for himself when he wants to create. So if you say that, and as such, this case of God's body does not go against the conclusion of the argument, right? In other words, the theist says, no, God creates his own body. It doesn't undermine our argument. Then we reply. What do we reply, right? So this is the Purva Paksha, opposing point of view. God doesn't need someone else to make his body. He just wills his own body into existence. Then we reply that the bodiless God, before God wills his own body, then he's bodiless then. So, right, there must have been a moment, a period before creation, before God wills his own body into creation, and then uses that body to create the world. Before that, he was bodiless. So the bodiless God, being like an emancipated soul, could not exercise any control. So he says, if God has a body, he would be like a liberated soul. Emancipated means liberated, like the yogis, they look liberation. And when you're liberated, you have no will, no desire, it's completely self-content. You don't have desires, and you have no need for action. You're blissfully absorbed in your own innermost being, in your own essential being, pure consciousness. So then he's saying, well, if God didn't have a body, he'd be like a liberated soul. He wouldn't have a desire to create. Okay, are we doing all right? We're following along. We'll skip Well, we'll do 78. We'll skip 79 and 80 because it's not clear what this pronoun refers to here, these. So I don't want to burden you. If it be argued that the production of God's body, he says the God, that's just sort of clunky English. If it be argued that the production of God's body too is controlled by his own intelligence. Oh, we just read that. So we're going to skip 79 and we're going to skip 80 and just go to 82. Okay, my friends, you don't have to do those. You don't have to worry about those. I didn't find there nothing worth our investing too much work in. Now let's move on to another argument, and we're almost done with Mīmāṃsā. So this is going to be a short class. There's no point then moving into Buddhism in the middle of one session. So this class will be less than an hour, quite a bit less than an hour, and that would mean that the next class will be, because totally we should have 2 hours and 40 minutes. So the next class will be longer. And we're just going to have one class on Buddhism. You don't have to do both the readings. There's 2 readings for Buddhism. I've looked at them carefully. I feel like one of them may be a bit too hard, a bit too difficult, and I don't want to make things more miserable for you. So you don't have to read Roger Jackson's article called Dharmakirti's Refutation of Theism. You don't have to read that. We're only going to read Hayes's article called Principled Atheism in the Buddhist Scholastic Tradition. And we'll try to do it. And so we'll have half of this class and one other class on Buddhism, and that will be it. But I'm not going to begin Buddhism in this lecture. So let's just keep this Mīmāṃsā. We'll label it Mīmāṃsā. Everybody knows what it is. And then tomorrow, whenever, I will then record a longer class to make up the balance of time, whatever we didn't use up. Each class should be an hour and 20 minutes, and we've been pretty good so far. We've actually, pretty much all our classes have been 1 hour and 20 minutes, but this is, this is not going to take us another 50 minutes. So let's just let it take what it wants to take, what it needs, and then we will add that extra missing bit into next class, maybe almost 2 hours or an hour and 45 minutes or whatever it needs to be. Okay, it'll be all Buddhism. Okay, so now what is the argument? 82 to 83. Of a person who is himself extremely pure, right? If God is pure, and everybody wants to say God is completely pure, a person believing in God is not going to believe in an impure God. You don't, right? We don't think of God as a demon or something, or an imperfect person or impure person. So of a person who is himself extremely pure, the modifications in the shape of the universe, right? The universe evolves and modifies into the forms of the universe. If the cause of that, if you want to say that God is the cause of that, then that God could not be impure, as the world is found to be, right? So the God must be pure. Oh, I'm sorry. Of a person who is himself extremely pure, God, the modifications in the shape of this world could not be impure. If God were pure, anything that comes from God should also be pure. That's the argument. You're going to say God is the cause of everything, creator of everything, and the universe emanates from God, then whatever emanates from God must be the same, have the same sort of nature as God, right? Light emanates from the sun, and light is luminous and hot. Maybe not as luminous and as hot as the sun, clearly not, but light isn't dark and cold. It must have at least the same qualities, maybe to a lesser extent, but the same qualities. So if God is all pure, all right, I should have put this in. If God is all pure, I didn't have my mic plugged in. If God is all pure, anything emanating with God can be pure, but we don't see that. The world is impure. It's full of suffering and evil. So that's the argument. So of a person who is himself extremely pure, the modifications, right, the emanations of that God in the shape of the universe could not be impure, as the world is found to be. Dharma, right? So the answer would be, well, the world is impure because living entities, have free will. They have to, if you they're not robots. So if you want to have free will, then there has to be freedom to act this way or that way, dharmically or adharmically. Dharma means righteous, and adharma These are words we're going to encounter a lot in the Gita. So, so therefore, the answer to this would be, well, so there's freedom and the living entities are free to act, and some act piously and in a godly way, and some don't, and some follow Dharma, some don't. So but then Mīmāṃsā says, well, Dharma too being absolutely under his power, if God has absolute power, this is the same argument that he mentioned previously. It's coming back to the same thing. Why is there evil in the world? And if Dharma and Adharma being absolutely under his power, it is not right and reasonable that there should be pain in the world. He would create a world where everybody is dharmic and there would be no pain. And if the activity of the world were to be dependent upon, regulated by these Dharma, etc., then they will be accepting something else, i.e. an agency other than God's desire. If you're going to say, well, really, it's Dharma that regulates the world, it's karma, the law of karma, which is what Mīmāṃsā does say. And why do we need God? If either God is in complete control of Dharma and Adharma and the law of karma, in which case he would create a world of happiness. It's not under God's complete control. And the happiness and suffering in the world is actually the result of Dharma and Adharma. If you want to say that, then you're saying that something other than God is causal to the existence and the state of the world. So there's something else other than God's desire, then you can't talk about God's desire in creation. Of course, it's obvious what a theist would say. This is not a particularly convincing argument, because a theist would say that God desires for the living entities to be free, and then he sets up a law called karma, and then he gives codes of Dharma and Adharma, and then you're free. If you follow Dharma, then you become, you get good births and eventually become liberated. If you follow Adharma, the opposite. And that is God's desire to set it up that way. But here his argument is saying, well, if you accept this Dharma and Adharma, the real regulators, and that's how you explain suffering. Otherwise, how do you explain suffering? If God is kind and benevolent, how are you going to explain suffering? Well, then if you say, well, it's karma, it's Dharma, it's, Dharma meaning duty, living entities that are dutiful, they don't suffer. And if they're not dutiful and they're, not nice, and they're not sensitive to their fellow creatures, if you take that position, then you introduce another power, another agent, another causal agency, another cause for the suffering of the world. That, call it a causal agent, someone who is, responsible for an action. Right. Now, moving on. The God himself being absolutely pure, for you theists say, right, he's introducing the Purva Paksha, the opposing point of view. The God himself being absolutely pure, and there being no other object at the time of creation. Now this is an argument against Advaita Vedanta. Do you remember Advaita Vedanta that says that because of Maya, ignorance, there appears to be a world of forms and shapes and with living entities. So I'm a living entity, you're a living entity, I'm in my form, you're in your form, there's all these forms around us. Here's the form of a jar. Some of the forms have living entities in them, the others are produced. So just products of nature. So, and then Shankara would say, but all this name and form, Nama Rupa, all this world of name and form is a mirage. Remember the mirage? It's only Brahman, right? We spoke a lot about this, so we're just reminding ourselves about this. So so there are really no names and forms. There's only Brahman. This is all an illusion. It's a superimposition. What's a superimposition? It's like in photography. You take a picture of a room and you want to create a picture of a ghost in the room. So you take a picture of a person in a white dress looking spooky, and you take another picture of the empty room, and then you take the one picture and superimpose it into the ghost, the lady in the white dress or man in a whatever in rags, and you superimpose it into the room. That's superimposition. It's actually not really there, but you artificially projected it on there. So that's how Shankara explains why it is that we see a world of forms and mountains and stars and trees and tables and objects and houses and men and women and animals and creatures. Superimposition. And what is that superimposition? It's illusion. It's Maya. Here he's calling it nescience, ignorance. It's an illusion. It's like the mirage in the desert, an illusion. So now this is an attack against Advaita Vedanta. Kumarila and the Mīmāṃsās are opponents of Advaita Vedanta. Because they believe in a real world, right? There's a real Veda, it's eternal. Words of the Veda are eternal, and keep swinging back and reinforcing points that we've made before, so that way we try to keep it all a little bit in our heads connected. So the word Vedas is a real eternal text, and what their contents must be real and eternal. So therefore the words of the Vedas must be real and eternal, and words have reference. They refer to things. So the word table refers to a table. It's not just a word in some book. It refers to something outside of itself. So therefore there must be a real world outside of the Veda. The words of the Vedas must refer to a real world. That's their position. So they don't like Shankara's argument that the world is because Shankara would say the Vedas are illusion too. He would say everything's an illusion. Even the sacred texts. Shankara would say even the Vedanta. Ultimately, the Vedanta helps you get out. But once you become enlightened, you realize even the Vedanta, the teachings of the Upanishads are part of the illusion too. But they're a useful part of the illusion because they help, like medicine in a psychiatric hospital. It helps you become cured. So Shankara would say the sacred texts, he would agree, the sacred texts are the only way of getting out of the illusion, but they're actually a very high level and benevolent part of the illusion, and they're useful and they're indispensable, but ultimately they're also, right, because texts have words that refer to things in the world. And ultimately there's no world and no agent, there's no action. The texts tell you to meditate, but who's the you? There is no you, there's only Brahman. What's meditating? The mind. There is no mind. That's an overlay. That's a projection onto Brahman. So Shankara would say, that even the texts are illusion. Well, Kumarila doesn't like that. Mīmāṃsā is not going to accept that. They want an eternal Veda. So this illusion then is called various things. Maya we'll encounter in the Gita, Maya, or avidya, ignorance. And here he translates that as nescience, not knowing, ignorance. So now he's completely changing subject, and he's saying the God himself, being absolutely pure, and there being no other object at the time of creation, right? Before creation, there's nothing else, there's only God. What could bring about the activity of nescience, which in falsity resembles a dream? Well, what causes the mirage? What causes this nescience of the world? What causes an Advaita Vedanta? There's only Brahman. So then what is this Maya that superimposes itself onto Brahman, projects itself onto Brahman, Sankshepa, transforms Brahman in an illusory way? What is it? There was nothing else. It's a big problem for Advaita Vedanta. You say nescience is separate from Brahman and it covers Brahman, well, you've created a duality. And Advaita means non-dual. We've had this argument and we'll just revisit it. You can't say nescience is in Brahman, because in Brahman, either it covers the whole of Brahman, and that's nonsensical. Because that's like saying the sun is entirely enveloped by darkness. Well, that goes against the definition of sun as a luminous body. You can't have a dark sun. It goes against the definition. It's an incoherent thing to say. And you can't say that nescience or ignorance covers a part of Brahman, because then you've created parts within Brahman. You can't say any of those things. So then what is this nescience? Ramanuja is going to argue the same thing. So here, Kumarila and the Mīmāṃsā are in agreement with the other Vedanta traditions, not the Advaita Vedanta ones, but Ramanuja's Vishishta Advaita, differentiated non-duality. Right? It's always good to cycle back and revisit some of the terms and arguments we've had. It's an introductory course and we have to pack a lot in. It's philosophy, my friends. This is a course of philosophy. Philosophy means intellectual rigor. It's hard work. I commend you all for stepping out of the box and taking a bit of a risk, some of you, to take this course. We tried to make the quiz, trust me, as easy as we possibly could. And really, if you did do the reading, and only you know if you did or you didn't. So be honest with yourselves. If you did do the reading and you did watch all the videos, then I think for the most part, you wouldn't have had a problem. If you didn't do that, then you can't, you know, it's not fair to complain that the course is difficult. You have to do the Dharma of the student and, you know, do the reading and watch the videos. So let's keep going. So the God himself being absolutely pure, there being no other object at the time of creation, there's nothing else, because you're saying God is the cause of everything. And Advaita Vedanta would then say, but the world appears because of a mirage. Well, what's this mirage? What could bring about the activity of nescience? What produces this mirage, which resembles a dream? It's false, like a dream. So from that point of view, if the mobility to activity, so if you say this Maya or ignorance, which causes activity, if it were held to be due to something other than Brahman, then you would have a duality. Advaita Vedanta, no duality. If you say this, whatever triggers this illusion, which creates a world of forms and agents who are mobile, who act, you're going to say it's all an illusion. Well, you've created something other than Brahman. This Brahman is not, by definition, and not illusion, but pure blissful consciousness. So you've created duality. Since you would be admitting the existence of Brahma and something else, this ignorance, this Maya, this sort of cloud of unreality that covers Brahman. However you want to frame it, haven't you created something else, says Kumarila, over and above Brahman? And if nescience, right, ignorance, avidya, Maya, itself were only natural, if you say, well, it's just natural, it's part of the nature of Brahman, and as such, not requiring any stimulation from without, it's just there, it's not some outside entity, some cloud hovering about that covers Brahman, some cloud of darkness, it's just part of the nature of Brahman. Then if it's nature of Brahman, then you could never strike it off, you can never be free of it, it would be part of your very nature, and then you'd never get liberated. If it was the nature of Brahman, but somehow inherent to Brahman, there is nescience, then that would be the nature of all the souls would have that same nature. So they will all be subject to ignorance eternally, because that would be their very nature. Just like the sunlight, it's always light. You can't not make it light. So if it's the nature of Brahman and of the souls to be subject to ignorance, it's just their very nature, then there'll be no such thing as liberation. And of course, Shankara would never accept that. Shankara's position is all about liberation. I think that's it. So he finishes up by a natural existence, like that of nescience, could be destroyed. You could only destroy it by the influence of something unique, like meditation. How do you destroy this ignorance? You need to have knowledge or meditate, or you need to have some practice that removes the ignorance. It doesn't just remove by itself. Don't worry about this last point. But he is basically saying, but if there's no agency in the self, Shankara denies agency in the self, because an agency is someone who acts, and someone who acts needs a world within which to act. So Shankara denies the world, therefore he denies agency. The soul in its pure nature is not an agent. It has no impulse to act. It's just pure consciousness. So then he's saying, well, how would you ever get liberated then? For those who have their only means of deliverance from nescience would be meditation. If that in the self, if you say it's just, then there's no agency in the pure self. So therefore there would never be liberation. Don't worry about this last point. He didn't really unpack it very, very thoroughly for us. Okay, but if you have no agency in the self, then there will be no motive for the self to seek liberation. It would always be in nescience, something like that. Either it would never be in nescience in the first place, or it would always be in nescience if it has no agency. Well, so that's it, my friends. That was Mīmāṃsā. I hope you got some of those arguments. And, mostly, desire. Why would God desire? What's the point in cyclical creativity? How can God create without a body? What else did we have? Why would he want to create in the first place? If he's omnipotent, why wouldn't he create a world of perfect happiness? Pay attention to the basic. You saw the quiz is very straightforward. Pay attention to the basic arguments, and you'll be fine with this section. And worldview Buddhism is going to be a bit more challenging, and that's why I want to just have one of the articles. The second one that we're not going to read is actually a little bit harder to read. It's probably not suitable for an undergraduate course. I've never used it before because this is the first time I teach a course on actually just on Īśvara. But I read it over and I thought, you know what, this may be a little bit hard for some of you, and we don't need to. It's kind of redundant. It covers a lot of the same material that the one article that we are going to read by Richard Hayes, Principled Atheism in the Buddhist Scholastic Traditions. That's on your syllabus. That's the one we'll be reading. You do not need to read the one by Roger Jackson. I will send you an email, a message on Canvas. So don't worry. You do not need to read Dharmakirti's refutation of theism. Okay, so this class has been about 50 minutes. That means we have half an hour left over, and perhaps we'll use that for the Buddhists. We'll probably need a bit more than an hour and 20 minutes. So technically we have an hour and 50 minutes. I know that's kind of long, but we've been pretty successful so far in sticking to our 2 units of 1 hour and 20 minutes. I hope you'll be okay with just this. In this case, it might happen again, but in order to just clearly separate the schools, otherwise you'll be confused. If all of it, in the middle of halfway through this lecture we finish Mīmāṃsā and start Buddhism, and you're gonna different kinds of arguments based on different metaphysics. Remember, the Mīmāṃsā's argument based on the eternality of the Veda. So they have a different metaphysics, right? So the Vedas are eternal, then the words must be eternal, then the objects must be eternal, then the world must be eternal. There's not even cyclical creation in Mīmāṃsā. They're the only Vedic school that doesn't accept remember, Vedanta says, what is Brahman? That from which the Janmadi Asya Yataha, creation, maintenance, and dissolution. And there's a period, we've gone through it. Mīmāṃsā doesn't accept any of that. So their metaphysics are different than Buddhism, where there is no eternal anything. Nothing is eternal. I don't want to mix those two in one lecture, okay? But again, just as a quick, because we have a lot to pack in next session. The Buddhists then the opposite of Mīmāṃsā, complete opposite. Mīmāṃsā, everything's eternal, objects, words, Vedas. Buddhists, nothing is eternal. Not only is things not eternal, but they're momentary. They're not even last a fraction of an instant. And then they produce the next moment, and that's why it appears as a flow of reality, but it's really a flow of moments, a bit like a movie. The old-fashioned movies? When I was a kid, there used to be this, is it silicone? The frames of a movie, and there's one shot followed by another shot followed by another shot. Each one is just a tiny bit different. So you see, someone riding on the horse, but really it's a bunch of stills. Each still follows the other, follows the other, and it gives a semblance of a flow of constant, substantial reality, but really it's a sequence of instants, just like that, or somewhat like that. The Buddhist notion of momentariness. So it appears that I'm sitting on this chair and I'm continuing to exist for an hour and 20 minutes, and the chair is still here, and it'll be here tomorrow. But every ingredient of that chair is only momentary, and then passes its imprint onto the next moment, the next moment, and the next moment. That's what reality is. So clearly they're going to, okay, so that's completely different metaphysics from Mīmāṃsā. And clearly they're not going to welcome and embrace the notion of an eternal Īśvara, the Buddhists, but because of different metaphysical presupposition, that's the point I want to make. That's why we're keeping it for next class, but I'm glad I got to say a few words so that next class you won't be going in a blank slate. Okay, my friends, so it's exactly 50 minutes, and I bid you all a good day.